Merci. Je vais faire une petite introduction en français avant que je commence ma présentation en anglais. Je vous remercie pour l'opportunité de présenter mon travail ici. Je vivement écouter vos impressions et questions. Aussi, je voudrais recogniser le travail de Joël Alouche Benayoun, mais on n'est pas là maintenant. Pendant mes études sur la communauté juive d'Algérie, j'ai lu tous ces œuvres et utilisé ces idées suivantes. C'est un grand honneur de présenter une petite section de ma thèse ici. Je vais, I just thank you. Okay, so Albert was born in 1939 in Gardaya, Algeria, located in the Saharan desert and lying along the left bank of the Wazif Valley. During his first year at lycée in Algiers, Albert became involved with a small Zionist group that recruited young Algerians to migrate to Israel. In 1956, Albert dropped out of the lycée and went to Toulouse for 4 months, where he trained in the latest farming techniques under primarily French Jews. He returned to Gardaya for a short period of time before migrating to Israel in 1957. Albert settled on kibbutz near...
Can you just speak?
Oh, sorry. I was nervous about the time. Albert settled on kibbutz near Aleyu for the next 2 years before becoming a parachutist in the Israeli army in 1959. He returned to the kibbutz in 1961, where he lived for the next 4 years. In the meantime, Albert's parents remained in Gardaya. His uncle Jacques was the director of the main post office, Le Grand Poste, in Algiers, and would change the stamps on the letters for Albert so that Arab neighbors with whom they had good relations would not discover where Albert was. According to all but close family, Albert was in Toulouse studying agriculture at the university. In 1962, like 125,000 other Algerian Jews, Albert's family left Gardaya and immigrated to France in the midst of the signing of the Avian Accords and on the eve of Algeria's independence. While 11,000 Algerian Jews chose to migrate to Israel, many of whom already had family there, which made it an attractive choice, Albert's family chose to follow their 3 other sons who were already studying in Marseille and Paris, respectively. The French government offered stipends to returning Pieds Noirs based on their assets in Algeria. With the aid of their former Muslim neighbors in Gardaya, Albert's parents were able to prove with pictures and documents that they had many assets and received enough funds to buy a small bed and breakfast in Paris in the 9th arrondissement. The hotel was large enough for Albert, his wife, and his kids to visit each summer, while his parents would visit Israel each winter to spend time with their eldest son and their grandchildren. Albert and his family's commitment to a mobile lifestyle in order to keep in touch represents a common trend that I argue was a key feature of Algerian Jewish life and identity in the first decade or so after the 1962 migrations. They account for just a few individuals out of thousands in the mobile Algerian Jewish collective, which traveled between France and Israel between 1962 and 1973. Over the last 4 years, I interviewed over 80 individuals from 23 different families, all of whom spoke in detail about their extensive travels between France and Israel in the years after their immigration from Algeria. Though each story was unique, 3 common threads emerged. 1. Even before 1962, Algerian Jews understood themselves as being of hybrid identity. They lived in a world marked by movement between France and Algeria. 2. After 1962, mobility and hybridity remained foundational components of Algerian Jewish identification and experience, but the poles shifted to Israel and France. The bonds that Jews actively maintained served both social and economic purposes that were inextricably linked. It was the transnational nature of Algerian Jewish identity pre-1962 that helped Algerian Jews living in both France and Israel after 1962 cope with the sudden changes. Number 3. The 1967 war disrupted these networks for the elder generation, who nonetheless continued to see themselves as hybrid and mobile. As the younger generation came of age, their self-perception conformed to geographic boundaries of the states in which they grew up. The transnational connections maintained by Algerian Jews living in France and Israel from 1962 to 1973 have not been studied extensively. The predominant focus on questions of integration and assimilation, which inherently confine studies to the borders of particular nation states, have presented an image of the Algerian Jewish migrant as immobile once settled in their new home. However, this was not the case for the first generation of Algerian Jewish immigrants who remained in contact and often visited family members, neighbors, and friends who lived beyond the national borders of the nation states in which they built new homes. Though both the Israeli and French governments provided different types of opportunities for Algerian Jews to secure housing, employment, and to adjust to life in new towns and cities, not all migrants used these resources. Many migrants found alternative channels to achieving these goals without relying on state aid or non-governmental resources of their non-government resources of their new nation-state homes. In fact, while settling into new homes, Algerian Jews moved back and forth between France and Israel, not only to maintain relationships with loved ones, but also to take advantage of economic opportunities beyond the borders of their host states. The roots of the Algerian Jewish mobile identity were planted long before 1962. While all Algerians had lived under French colonial rule since 1830, the turning point for Algerian Jews occurred in 1870. That year, the Premier Decree granted French citizenship to the Jews of Algeria. Virtually overnight, Algerian Jews were now grouped with the larger population of French citizens that had settled in Algeria rather than their fellow indigenous Algerians. The new connection with France afforded Algerian Jews opportunities to attend university and to begin their careers in France. Between 1870 and 1962, Jews moved back and forth, particularly between Marseille and Algiers, for education and economic opportunities. Indeed, the colonial government kept records of how many Algerian Jews who had reported their primary home as being in Algeria resided in France each month. For example, within any given month during any given year between 1950 and 1962, nearly one-third of the Jewish community of Oran, Constantine, and Algiers resided in France. For Algerian Jews, even before the 1962 migrations, their emerging hybrid French-Algerian Jewish identity was marked by mobility. This hallmark of their identity persisted after the exodus of 1962. For Algerian Jews residing in Israel, their ties to French culture remained strong, as well as their desire to remain in contact with the members of their community wherever they had settled. Their connection to France, which included physical movement in both directions, remained regardless of the fact they were living in Israel rather than Algeria. For Algerian Jews residing in France, they maintained their economic and personal connections abroad as a means to thrive in their new home. The journals and newspapers published by the Algerian Jewish community offer insight into the mobile and transnational mindset of its members. The most widely read and well-known paper called L'Information Juive, which was founded in 1948 by Jacques Lazare, who also served as the paper's editor-in-chief. Lazare consistently argued for preservation of a specific Jewish identity, which he defined as identification with Israel on the one hand and an attachment to both native Algerian and French culture on the other. He believed strongly that these identities could coexist. The paper attempted to follow the destinies of North African Jewish immigrants to Israel, France, and other states. The last issue that was published in Algeria appeared in March of 1962. But as of September 1963, it reappeared in France and was circulated in Israel as well. Scholars have understood this transition in the tone of the paper as a purposeful move by the editors to give Jewish immigrants a voice to share their difficulties in adjusting to life in France following decolonization. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to highlight two issues, the one that appeared in Algiers in March of 1962 and the one that appeared in France in September of 1963, and there was an 18-month gap in which the paper was not published. The front page of every edition of L'Information Juive from the Algerian Civil War era contained a column with headlines on France, on Israel, from the rest of the world, thus highlighting the three arenas in which the readership would identify and be interested. The final issue of Information Juive, published in Algiers on 14 March 1962, epitomizes the global mindset of the Algerian Jewish community before the exodus from Algeria a few months later. The front cover reports on the establishment of new synagogues in Paris, a conference led by Andrei Shiraki, identified as an advisor to the head of government in Haifa, in which non-European Jewish students were able to talk about the problems of assimilation in Israel. There is also a featured article on Tu B'Shvat, the Jewish holiday, which originally marked the beginning of the agricultural cycle and more recently had become a celebration of the environment and trees. The article described the different ways in which Jews celebrated the holiday in both France and Israel. Within the 4-page pamphlet were specific articles on the conditions of Jewish life in Morocco and Tunisia. The articles focused on the dwindling population of Jews in both locales. The Tunisian section listed the names of important Jewish community members who left the country for Israel, while the Tunisian section went into detail about the holiday of Passover that was coming up, and they were very concerned with things like how much flour cost and would there be enough for the Tunisian population there. Readers were deeply concerned with the ongoings in their neighboring French-dominated Maghrebi countries. It is important to note that it is not until the 3rd page that readers encountered any section on life in Algeria. In this particular issue, there was a discussion of a ceremony in the Algiers synagogue to commemorate the victims of violence during the Civil War, a celebration of Purim, marriage announcements, and obituaries. The location of national news, or even just local news about Algerian Jewish communities on the final page, is symbolic of the fact that the readership of Information Juive was more interested in international news, specifically about Jews outside of Algeria, than local news, or Jews inside of Algeria. Inside, readers would first find news concerning France and Israel, followed by Morocco and Tunisia, and only thereafter about Algeria. Most of the issues of Information Juive that were published between 1956 and 1962 shared this layout, which focused on Algerian topics on the inner pages and highlighted international news on the front cover and second page. On September 14, 1963, L'Information Juive was published for the first time in Paris, exactly 1 year and 6 months after its last issue, published in Algeria. The layout of the paper was starkly different from its previous incarnation. Editors had deleted the section from France, which formerly occupied the top left-hand corner of the front page each edition. Instead, the column that ran alongside the pamphlet, which now focused on 2 subjects instead of 3, were Israel and the world. The section on Israel was brief in this particular issue, and instead the world section was longer, and it highlighted developments which took place from everywhere from the Soviet Union, the United States, and Morocco. The premier article below the banner of the newspaper was called Au-delà de l'épreuve, which I translated as Above the Ordeal, explained to the reader that the newspaper had taken a break due to the difficult situation in Algiers and that it had entered into a new phase in France. The author, who is implied to be Jacques Lazarou, noted that because 125,000 of the Jews from Algeria now lived in France, it made sense to relocate the headquarters there. He continued to explain, however, that the paper still sought to cover issues concerning all Algerian Jews, not just the ones currently living in France. The reorganization of L'Information Juive was supported by a new society called l'Association des Juifs Originaires d'Algérie en France, known as the AJOA. Page 3 of this issue is devoted to introducing the society and expressing its missions and goals. The mission statement of the association was to, quote, defend material, moral, and religious rights of Jewish people from Algeria that now live in France. The association created many local chapters in cities around France in the hope that local representatives would meet the needs of each community. The immediate concern was the lack of the availability of kosher meat. The local chapters of HAOA began preliminary discussions about creating networks of exchange to make kosher meat more readily accessible to smaller communities, particularly those outside of major cities such as Marseille and Paris. The majority of the articles in the first edition of the paper in France indeed dealt with the exile of the North African community to France, and some to Israel. Their main articles on pages 2 to 3 covered the conditions of the Algerian, Tunisian, and Moroccan communities. So too did a large article on page 5, which dealt with the integration of repatriated Jews in France. Page 4 discussed Algerian Jews living in Israel and a parallel organization to the AJOA called the L'Union des Olim. Olim is the Hebrew word for immigrants. It comes from the word aliyah. D'Algérie, which I translated in English as the Union of Algerian Immigrants in Israel. The main article in this section, entitled The Days of French Judaism in Israel, or Les Journées de Judaïsme Français en Israel, called for the protection of the large Algerian Jewish community in general, and specifically the small community of Algerian Jews which chose not to live in diaspora, but rather to settle in Israel. Okay. The AJOA and the Union des Olim plan to assign ambassadors who would travel between the communities of France and Israel to maintain a strong connection among the members of the global Algerian Jewish community. The aims were twofold: to ensure a strong bond between the minority of Algerian Jews living in Israel and the larger Algerian Jewish community, and 2, to strengthen the connection to Israel among Algerian Jews living in France. The comparison of the March 62 and September 63 papers offers a window into the drastic shift in identity that the Algerian Jewish community experienced upon settling in France. Before 1962, Algerian Jewish identity was marked by a hybrid French-Algerian axis, which encompassed a cultural affiliation with France and an enduring bond to the non-Jewish Muslim majority community in Algeria, which I have addressed elsewhere. A major component of the French piece of this hybrid identity included a desire to participate in the world Jewish community as Algerian French Jews. The mass migrations of 1962 created an Algerian French Jewish diaspora whose members were accustomed to looking beyond their national borders to satisfy all components of their complex hybrid identity as French citizens, Algerians, and Jews. Therefore, it made sense that they continue to seek relationships beyond the boundaries of their new communities in order to not only craft, but also maintain their identity as Algerian Jews in their new lands. There are numerous examples of how Algerian Jews creatively cultivated and maintained their personal and economic networks, not only for the purposes of remaining in touch with family members as Albert's family, but to prosper and carve out a niche for themselves in their new homes. I interviewed many people that had really interesting stories, so since I only have 5 minutes left, I'll just tell you one. There was a cool family. Their last name was Taleb, and the brothers were Samuel and Joseph, and their father opened a restaurant, a small cafe in Marseille after they moved to Marseille, and the restaurant opened in '64, and it was failing miserably. So Joseph, who had fallen into this niche group of Zionists in Marseille, he decided to just go to Israel to see what was going on there. And he knew one person there from their town in Bonn in Algeria. I forget his name. His name was Isaac. And Isaac was working for a falafel restaurant owned by a Yemenite family. Joseph had the brilliant idea that this falafel idea would save his family's restaurant, and he wrote letters to his brother Samuel: come visit Israel, you must come, this will save the restaurant. So Samuel finally comes, he agrees, it's a great idea, and within a year, both Samuel and Joseph go back to Marseille, and they redo the whole menu of their father's restaurant to enormous success. The new menu was extremely popular, and the restaurant became renowned in the local community, and the clientele was no longer just their few friends and neighbors who felt bad for them. It was the entire Marseille community, which extended beyond the Jewish community, beyond the Pied Noir community, everyone. In the fall of '67, Joseph became disheartened by the French shift in foreign policy toward the state of Israel in the aftermath of the Arab-Israeli War of that year, and he migrated permanently to Tel Aviv. He opened his own restaurant there using the same name as the restaurant in Marseille, and they shared recipes and supplies when possible, and they both noted that during the '73 war, Samuel in France would have to send supplies to Joseph in Israel because he couldn't get the proper supplies to keep the restaurant working. And they also shared clients, so as their friends would move back and forth between Marseille and Israel, they would visit the restaurant of L'Autre Frère. I kept hearing about L'Autre Frère, and I had to keep in mind which brother they were talking about. So that was just one example. I'm just going to skip around. So these mobiles networks, my main argument is that these mobiles networks flourished throughout the first decade after the initial migrations of '62. But as we see with Joseph and Samuel's story, there are really two main shifts in this. The 1967 war in Israel and the 1973 war, where a lot of immigrants that had initially settled in Israel choose to come back to France, and even some immigrants in France choose to go to Israel. So we see the poles shifting a little bit. And I guess the coda to all this, which is an introduction to the next talk, is that as this second generation of Algerian immigrants grew up, they identified less with this hybrid porous identity that had Israel and France as its poles, and began to express their identity strictly as French or Israeli. So for example, to end my talk where I began with Albert, as his daughter grew up, she declared herself an Israeli to me in the interview, whereas her cousins declared themselves as French. And when asked to identify their cousins, Nitzan said, "Oh, my cousins are French, but I'm Israeli." And her cousin said, "Well, I'm French and they're Israeli." So we see different manifestations of these identities with the second generation. And I'll end there.